At 2:47 a.m., the Vatican doesn't feel like a sanctuary. It feels like the moment before a verdict is read. The corridors beyond Pope Leo XIV's private office are still, too still, like the whole city-state is holding its breath. In the distance, somewhere behind stone and velvet and centuries of locked doors, a clock marks the minutes with the calm certainty of something that has outlived every scandal it ever buried. Soon, that calm will break. Not in one country. Not in one diocese. Across the entire Catholic world. Because within days, when families expect candlelight, choirs, and the familiar comfort of midnight mass, millions will wake to a different kind of Christmas. Locked church doors. Bare altars. Silence where the world has always been promised a song. Outside Leo's office, the Vatican is already dressed for wonder. Men in work gloves carry ornament crates through service hallways as if they're transporting hope by hand. Schedulers shuffle broadcast plans meant to send the Pope's Christmas liturgy through satellites and into living rooms from Manila to Mexico City. In quiet studios, producers rehearse camera angles like choreography, because this is the one night the church is supposed to look eternal, spotless, untouched by time. In St. Peter's Square, designers argue over the nativity display the way generals argue over maps. Where the shepherds should stand. How the light should fall. Which expression belongs on the face of Mary. Everything is calibrated to look like innocence. But inside the papal office, innocence is not part of the decor. There are no carols. No glow from stained glass. No cheerful bustle drifting under the door. Just a single lamp, harsh and surgical, cutting shadows across an old desk that has held too many secrets. And on that desk, stacks of documents that don't read like reports. They read like evidence. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Provost, doesn't look up as the clock ticks. His shoulders are forward, braced as if against impact. His eyes move from page to page with the patient precision of a man dissecting a wound that refuses to close. Numbers. Transfers. Ledger trails that vanish into foundations with saintly names and reappear in accounts that were never meant to exist. Donations marked for shelters and emergency relief. Funds collected with Christmas season urgency, for the poor, for the displaced, for healing. And yet the totals don't reach the people they were meant to save. They dissolve into silence. Leo had been elected when the Church wanted stability more than truth. A swift conclave. A careful choice. The kind of Pope cardinals could present to the world as a steady hand after a bruising season of scandal and exhaustion. Some called him a caretaker, a man meant to keep the engine running until the storms passed. But storms don't pass when the house is rotten. Leo did not inherit a monument. He inherited a patient on a table, feverish, compromised, and surrounded by attendants who had grown too skilled at calling decay necessary administration. He flips another page. A payout delayed until the victim gives up. A complaint reclassified and filed away. A priest transferred for pastoral reasons. A line item labeled legal support that swells every year as if sin has a budget and the budget is protected. And then, the figure that stops feeling like math. 72 million euros. Not misplaced. Not misunderstood. Traced. Routed. shaped into something functional, like a system. Leo stares at the number long enough for it to become something else in his mind, not currency, but weight. The kind that bends the spine. The kind that makes every hymn sound like a performance. Because Christmas is the Church's brightest night, the one night even the indifferent will glance toward Rome expecting warmth, mercy, a story about light entering the world. And Leo is reading proof that the same season of giving has been used as cover. Not just for incompetence. For protection. The deeper he goes, the clearer the pattern becomes. The Church has learned how to endure outrage. How to survive investigations. How to outlast victims. What it has not learned, what it has refused to learn, is repentance that costs something. On the corner of the desk lies a draft decree. The formal language of a motu proprio, already shaped by advisers who assumed it would be theatrical, a warning shot, a symbolic threat, a gesture meant to frighten the bureaucracy into moving. Leo has rewritten it in his own hand. Not a warning. A law. A worldwide suspension of Christmas Mass. A collective fasting from celebration until the truth is paid for in action, until the money is found, the channels exposed, the damage acknowledged in something more substantial than apologies. He looks at the final line. The one that will turn tradition into silence. And for the first time that night, Leo's expression shifts, not into fear, but into something colder, decision. Because to him, Christmas cannot be performed like a theater, while the Church uses darkness as an infrastructure. If the institution insists on hiding what it has done, then the only honest liturgy left may be the one that doesn't pretend. The clock ticks again. 2:48 a.m. The Vatican continues preparing to celebrate the light. And in a room lit like an operating theater, Pope Leo XIV prepares to switch it off. Before the decree is released, before the leak, the panic, the consistory, and the worldwide silence, there is the story that led him here, the audits that arrived sealed, the names that never made the headlines, and the money that was never supposed to move at all. Quick moment, subscribe now. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release. It started, for Pope Leo XIV, with a delivery that didn't look important. A plain portfolio. Grey. Unmarked. The kind of folder Vatican staff carried every day without thinking. It arrived 3 weeks after his election, slipped into his private correspondence like a misfiled memo, accompanied by a short note from the Prefecture for the Economy. Most Holy Father. As requested, the preliminary consolidation of external findings. Some items require your personal direction. No flourish. No ceremonial language. Nothing that hinted the pages inside would redraw his understanding of what his throne actually sat on. Leo remembered turning the folder over once, weighing it in his hand, and feeling, irrationally, that it weighed more than paper should. As if the contents had their own gravity. As if the Vatican itself had tried to compress decades into something portable. He opened it that same night. Not in the formal receiving room where aides could hover and interpret and soften. Not at the long table where documents were meant to be reviewed. He opened it alone, under a lamp, the way a surgeon studies scans before deciding where to cut. The first pages were clean enough to fool a casual eye, charts, categories, summaries of administrative reallocations. The sort of language built to anesthetize. But Leo's mind didn't move like a casual eye. He had spent years in governance, years in meetings where men spoke in velvet phrases to hide the ugly machinery underneath. He knew how institutions survived, not by lying outright, but by drowning truth in polite vocabulary. He flipped past the summaries and found the raw ledgers. The numbers were not chaotic. That was the first shock. Corruption, when it was sloppy, left fingerprints everywhere, panic transfers, clumsy withdrawals, desperate patchwork. This was different. This was architecture. A system with symmetry. Funds moved in patterns that repeated with the patience of ritual. A charity in Spain received special assistance from a foundation in Switzerland. The foundation in Switzerland had just received an endowment from an American donor pool that had been marketed, in December, as Christmas mercy giving. The American pool had, in turn, been reconciled with a Vatican-managed account labeled Pastoral Emergencies. Pastoral Emergencies. The phrase was a soft blanket thrown over a fire. Leo read on, tracking the lines the way a hunter tracks prints in snow. Each transfer came with a justification, each justification wrapped in morality, support for the faithful, continuity of mission, protection of unity. Protection of unity. He had heard that phrase his entire life. It was the Vatican's favorite prayer. It could excuse anything. Silence. Delay. Transfers. Confidentiality. It could turn the church into a fortress and call the walls a care. The first case file was from a diocese in South America. The name of the accused priest was redacted in the summary, but not in the attachments. There were statements from victims. There were dates. There were signatures of bishops who had promised action and then postponed it in carefully scheduled increments until the victims gave up or disappeared into adulthood and fatigue. And then, on page 14, an invoice. A law firm. An amount. A line item, settlement strategy and confidentiality planning. Leo stared at the words until they stopped being words and became an image, a table, a pen, a hand guiding a signature, a silence purchased and packaged like a service. He set the file down and exhaled slowly through his nose. The Vatican at night was famous for its stillness. The world imagined it as holy calm, a hush that held prayer. But Leo knew the truth of quiet buildings. Quiet was not always peace. Quiet could be concealment. Quiet could be the absence of witnesses. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the sleeping city. The dome of St. Peter's rose like a promise against the dark. Somewhere beyond it, Rome pulsed with its own life, cars, late voices, distant laughter, human noises that did not ask permission to exist. Inside the apostolic palace, existence always asked permission. He returned to the desk and kept reading. That week, he slept in fragments. Not because he couldn't rest, but because he refused to. Every time he shut his eyes, the same sensation returned, that the church, under his hands, was not merely wounded but infected, and that the infection had learned how to mimic health. By the end of the first portfolio, he had requested more. Quietly. Directly. Without committees. His aides thought he was gathering background to understand the financial picture. They believed he wanted to be a prudent administrator, a careful steward. It was safer, for them, to imagine he was collecting information for a slow reform, years of consultation, pastoral letters, commissions that could be celebrated as progress without changing anything too quickly. Leo let them believe it, because belief was a useful anesthetic. The second portfolio arrived sealed, with a wax stamp so old-fashioned it felt like a warning. Inside were the forensic reports. Not the Vatican's own. External. Independent. Generated by an accountability commission that had been authorized in the final months of his predecessor's papacy. A commission meant, officially, to assist healing. A commission meant, unofficially, to protect the institution by demonstrating effort. The irony was brutal. The commission had been created as optics, and in its diligence it had uncovered reality. Leo's eyes moved across the report headings. Irregularities in restricted funds. Offshore routing through religious foundations. Settlement expenditures misclassified as charitable aid. Pattern timing aligned with seasonal donation surges. Seasonal donation surges. He didn't need to guess what season they meant. Christmas. The Church's most profitable holiness. Every year, Catholics who had not entered a church in months returned for the story of light in darkness. Families donated because Christmas made them want to believe in goodness again. Parishes ran drives. Vatican campaigns launched. The word mercy appeared on banners, on envelopes, on screens. Mercy became a marketing calendar. Leo kept reading, and the report's tone shifted from cautious to alarmed. There were transaction maps, network diagrams, charts showing fund convergences that spiked every December, money gathering like a tide, then dispersing through channels that had nothing to do with shelters or war relief or victims. It wasn't just diversion. It was conversion. Charity turned into a solvent for sin. Leo felt something in him tighten, not anger, exactly, but a hardening of resolve, like steel cooling after it had been heated too long. He was not a romantic man. He didn't become pope because he loved ceremonies. He had been elected because the Church's leaders needed a mind that could see through slogans, a steady hand after internal fractures. They thought he would preserve the structure. They did not understand what kind of preservation he believed in. He believed, with a frightening purity, that some structures could only be saved by being cut open. The third portfolio did not arrive by courier. It arrived through Cardinal Pietro Serentino. Serentino, Secretary of State, was the Vatican's most polished instrument, diplomatic, careful, trained in the language of survival. He came to Leo's office in the late afternoon, his face composed into the calm mask of a man who had delivered bad news so often it no longer changed his pulse. "Most Holy Father," he said, and then paused as if weighing how much truth could safely exist in the room. Leo did not invite him to sit. He did not offer tea. He simply waited. Serentino placed a folder on the desk. This one was black. Thinner. More discreet. "This," Serentino said, "is sensitive." Leo opened it without permission. Inside were memos, internal communications flagged as high risk. Names of dioceses. Names of bishops. Names of donors. Notes about public narratives and media management. The kind of writing that treated victims as variables in a strategy. Leo's fingers stopped on one paragraph. We must avoid a precedent where financial transparency leads to claims escalation. Settlements should remain pastoral, not legal. Pastoral, not legal. It was the Vatican's way of keeping wrongdoing in the realm of confession rather than court. Leo looked up at Serentino. "How long have you known?" he asked. Serentino's eyes did not flinch. "We suspected. We didn't have consolidated proof. And now we do." "Yes." Leo leaned back slightly. "And you brought this to me because you want me to, what?" Serentino held his hands together in front of him, fingers interlaced. "Because you are newly elected. Because the world is watching. Because Christmas is approaching." There it was, the real reason, spoken with diplomatic softness. Christmas was a stage, and stages required control. "Christmas," Leo repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Serentino continued, voice low. "It is the Church's most visible moment. The one time even governments look at us with warmth. The one night the world remembers beauty. If this information becomes public now, if it is mishandled, if it is exposed," Leo corrected. Serentino hesitated. "If it is exposed in a way that appears chaotic, yes. We risk fracture." Fracture. Another Vatican prayer. Leo closed the black folder. "Thank you, Eminence," he said. Serentino exhaled in relief, too soon. He believed the meeting had gone the way meetings often went, problem acknowledged, crisis to be managed, time to be bought. Leo's voice stopped him at the door. "Tell me," Leo said, "how many Christmas campaigns are currently planned?" Serentino turned back, cautious. "Several. Global. Coordinated with major dioceses." "And how much do we expect to raise?" Serentino's throat tightened. "It is significant." Leo nodded once, as if confirming a diagnosis. "Then we will not raise it." Serentino's mask slipped for half a second. "Most Holy Father." "We will not take money from the faithful," Leo said, "to use it as a sponge." Serentino's gaze sharpened. "You are assuming misuse is inevitable." Leo's eyes held his. "No. I am recognizing pattern." Serentino's voice softened into pleading. "There are ways to handle this. Quietly. There are reforms that can be announced. Commitments. A new commission. A performance," Leo said, and the word came out flat. "You mean we can perform remorse?" Serentino's jaw tightened. "You are the Pope. Your role is also to protect the Church." Leo stood. He was not tall, but in that moment he seemed to fill the room with something unmovable. "I am protecting it," he said. "From becoming a lie that wears vestments." Serentino left without arguing further, because arguing further would reveal too much fear. When the door closed, Leo returned to his desk and pulled out the commission report again. He studied the transaction maps until he could see them with his eyes closed. The system had a rhythm. It moved like a liturgy: donation, collection, reroute, conceal, justify. He began writing notes in the margins. Not emotional notes. Surgical ones. Freeze restricted funds. Mandatory external audit, every diocese. Public Victim Fund, controlled independently. Asset liquidation, non-essential properties. Immediate suspensions, non-compliance. The words on the page were a blueprint for war. As December approached, the Vatican's visible world grew brighter. More wreaths. More lights. More rehearsals. More cheerful press releases. The contrast became obscene. Leo began taking walks alone through the apostolic palace at night. Not for exercise. For reconnaissance. He watched the workers string lights in hallways where portraits of popes stared down like ancestors. He passed storage rooms where nativity figures lay wrapped in cloth, waiting to be placed in St. Peter's Square like a promise of innocence. He stopped once in front of a carved wooden shepherd and found himself studying the painted face. The shepherd's eyes were wide, trusting, turned upward as if the world had never hurt him. Leo thought of the victim statements he had read. The ones written in careful language, because even trauma had learned to be polite in the church. I was 12. He said God would understand. They told my mother to be quiet. He kept walking. On December 3rd, a new file landed on his desk, thin, but lethal. A reconciliation summary. The Commission had finally finished tracing the December donation routes over the past decade. They had isolated what they called diversion magnitude. The figure was highlighted in the center of the page like a wound you couldn't ignore. 72 million euros. Leo didn't react outwardly. He simply sat very still and let the number settle in him. 72 million was not a mistake. It wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't mismanagement. It was a choice repeated often enough to become policy. A door opened quietly behind him. Monsignor Rizzi, one of Leo's closest aides, stepped inside with a cautious expression. "Holy Father," he said softly, "the liturgy committee would like your approval on the Christmas schedule." Leo did not look away from the paper. "Do they?" "Yes. Broadcast timings, procession routes, the—" "Tell them no," Leo said. Rizzi blinked. "No, Holy Father." "No schedule," Leo said. "No approval." Rizzi hesitated, as if waiting for the explanation that would make the refusal fit inside normal reality. "Is there a problem with the timing?" Leo finally looked up, and Rizzi saw something in his eyes that made him instinctively lower his voice further. "There is a problem with the truth," Leo said. Rizzi swallowed. "Holy Father, Christmas is not a costume," Leo interrupted. Rizzi's face tightened with confusion. "I don't understand." "You will," Leo said, and his tone made it clear the understanding would not be gentle. When Rizzi left, Leo opened his desk drawer and removed a draft decree, the motu proprio his advisers had suggested as a symbolic act of penance. They had imagined it as dramatic but safe, a partial reduction of celebrations, a call for fasting, a strongly worded appeal. Leo had read their draft and felt the same disgust he felt when he read pastoral, not legal. Symbolic penance was how institutions avoided real payment. He had rewritten the decree over several nights, line by line, until it no longer resembled their idea. His version was blunt. All public Christmas masses are suspended worldwide. No exceptions without explicit authorization. All saved funds and seasonal donation collections are redirected to victim compensation and emergency relief under independent oversight. Any cleric who knowingly circumvents this decree faces immediate suspension. Any bishop who refuses obedience will be removed. It was not a plea. It was a command. As he read it again, Leo felt the weight of what he was about to do press into the room like a second presence. Because he understood the Vatican better than the men who feared it. He understood how tradition functioned, not merely as worship, but as identity. Christmas Mass was not an event. It was the annual proof, especially for the lukewarm, that the Church was still what it claimed to be. To suspend it would feel, to many, like an assault on God Himself. The world would not interpret it as an internal purification. They would interpret it as punishment, madness, tyranny. Some would say he was destroying the Church. Others would say he was finally telling the truth. And inside the Vatican, in rooms thick with old power, men would see the real danger. If Leo could cancel Christmas, then no tradition was safe from accountability. He set the decree on the desk and looked at the pen beside it. Ordinary, black, unremarkable. The kind of pen that should have signed blessings, not detonations. The clock on his desk ticked toward 2:47 a.m. again, the same hour, night after night, that seemed to return like a warning. Leo rested his fingers on the pen but did not lift it. He did not pray aloud. He did not ask for guidance. Not because he lacked faith, but because he had already made the decision in the part of himself that did not negotiate. He saw the Church like a body on a table. And he saw the infection. You didn't negotiate with infection. You removed it, or you died pretending you were healthy. Outside his office, the Vatican continued preparing for Christmas as if nothing had changed. Inside, Pope Leo XIV held a pen over a decree that would force the entire world to confront what the Church had spent decades learning how to hide. And in that suspended moment, ink not yet touching paper, he understood fully. Once he signed, there would be no undoing it. Pope Leo XIV lowered the pen. The first stroke was quiet. No thunder. No choir collapsing into silence. Just black ink entering parchment with the soft scratch of inevitability. He signed once. Then again. The final flourish was almost indifferent, as if he were approving a routine transfer instead of severing the most anticipated ritual on the Christian calendar. When he finished, he didn't sit back in triumph. He didn't look relieved. He simply stared at the page the way a man watches a door close behind him. Then he pressed the call button. "Monsignor Rizzi," he said when the aide answered, voice steady. "Prepare a secure transmission. Highest encryption. Distribution list, all apostolic nunciatures, all metropolitan archdioceses, all dicasteries involved in liturgy and finance." A pause. "Holy Father, the schedule approval is irrelevant. Leo said. "This goes out at dawn." He set the receiver down. The clock on his desk read 2:53 a.m. Outside the window, the Vatican remained asleep. Inside, something ancient had just been cut. By Vatican standards, secure meant layered secrecy, a draft transmitted through a courier network, encrypted files passed from one protected terminal to another, access granted only to those whose fingerprints were already inside the machine. It was meant to move like blood through arteries, unseen, controlled. But even arteries rupture. At 7:18 a.m., in the Nunciature of Brussels, a junior attaché named Father Lucien Varga stepped into the communications room carrying coffee and impatience. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was covering for a senior official who had overslept after a diplomatic dinner that ran long, lubricated by Belgian wine and Vatican caution. The secure terminal hummed with a pending packet labeled "Urgent, Holy See, Strict Confidential." Varga's instructions were simple: confirm receipt, forward to the nuncio's private device, and log the chain of custody. He followed protocol until the terminal displayed a preview window, just a few lines. A glitch, perhaps, or a careless setting left in place from a previous operator. He saw the heading first. Motu proprio, suspensio celebrationum natalis Domini. Suspension of the celebrations of the Nativity of the Lord. His coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. He leaned in, eye scanning the first paragraph. All public celebrations of Christmas Mass are hereby suspended worldwide. For a moment, his brain refused the sentence. It treated it like a mistranslation, a joke, a draft that would never survive committee review. But the line was too clean. Too final. Too Roman. He stared long enough for fear to replace disbelief. Then he did what frightened young men always did in institutions built on hierarchy. He sought an adult. He left the room and hurried down the corridor to the nuncio's office, forgetting that panic itself was an enemy of secrecy. Forgetting that halls carried sound. Forgetting that diplomats were trained to hear changes in footsteps. When Archbishop Willem de Smet opened his door, Varga's face was pale. "Excellency," he said, voice cracked. "It's from Rome. It's a decree. It cancels." De Smet didn't let him finish. He reached past him, walked briskly to the terminal, and stared at the preview lines. For 3 seconds, the nuncio didn't move. Then he whispered, not as a prayer, but as an assessment, "This will ignite." He hit close. The preview vanished. Too late. The damage wasn't that Varga had read it. The damage was that de Smet now knew a decision had been made that diplomacy could not massage. And in the Vatican, knowledge always traveled faster than permission. De Smet placed an encrypted call to the Secretariat of State. The line connected on the second ring. Cardinal Pietro Serentino listened without interrupting, his face already tight as if he had been waiting for this call all his life. When de Smet finished, Serentino closed his eyes for a single beat, one controlled breath that looked almost like prayer. "Archbishop," he said softly, "you will not speak of this. Not to your staff. Not to local bishops. Not to governments." De Smet's voice came back strained. "Eminence, with respect, How do we prepare for something like this without preparing? We don't, Serentino said, and that single word held the Vatican's oldest weapon, denial by delay. We contain. We wait for the Holy Father's official communication. What if the media? They won't have it, Serentino snapped, then softened immediately, diplomatic again. They cannot have it. But as he hung up, Serentino knew the truth. If one junior attaché could glimpse it, the system had already failed. And failure, in the modern world, didn't remain local. Serentino moved through the apostolic palace like a man walking toward a firing squad while still maintaining posture. He passed staff decorating halls, past rehearsals being discussed in cheerful tones, past the nativity planners carrying sketches like sacred blueprints. All of it looked obscene now. When he reached the papal office, Swiss guards announced him, and the door opened without ceremony. Pope Leo XIV sat at his desk as if he had never moved since the night before. The lamp was on. The grey binder was within reach. The decree lay in a folder, signed, sealed, waiting. Serentino didn't sit. He didn't waste time with greetings. "Holy Father," he said, voice careful, "we have a problem." Leo glanced up. "We have many problems." The decree previewed in Brussels. A glitch. A junior cleric saw the opening paragraph. "The nuncio has informed me." Leo's expression didn't change. "Then we proceed." Serentino's composure cracked, not into emotion, but into urgency. "Proceed," he repeated, as if the word belonged to a different universe. "This cannot be treated like a routine administrative act. This will cause unrest. Governments will respond. In some places, Mexico, Poland, the Philippines, Christmas Mass is not merely religious. It is cultural structure. You will. I will disrupt a performance," Leo said, calm as a scalpel. "Yes." Serentino's hands opened, palms upward, pleading as if offering facts like sacrifices. "Holy Father, you will be accused of punishing the faithful for sins they did not commit. You will be accused of tyranny. Schism is not an abstract fear. Bishops will defy. Priests will celebrate underground masses. Families will break. Some will never return." Leo's eye stayed on him, unblinking. "And the victims?" he asked. Serentino hesitated. "What of them?" Leo's voice lowered, not with anger, but with a firmness that made the room feel smaller. "Their families broke," he said. "Some never returned. Many were punished for sins they did not commit. They stared at locked doors in different ways. They asked for help and were given silence with incense on it." Serentino swallowed. "I am not arguing against accountability. I am arguing against this method. There are steps. Announcements. A commission. A penitential service. A global day of prayer." "A global day of prayer is cheap," Leo said. "It is not cheap to the faithful," Serentino pressed. "Christmas is, it is the Church's one universal moment of tenderness. You take that away, and what remains? Headlines. Rage. a world saying the Church has lost its mind. Leo's gaze moved to the folder holding the signed decree. "What remains," he said, "is truth that costs something." Serentino leaned forward. "Holy Father, you cannot govern 1 billion souls by shock." Leo's reply was quiet enough that it felt like the room leaned in to hear it. "I am not shocking them," he said. "I am matching reality." Serentino frowned. "What reality?" Leo's eyes lifted again. "The reality that faith has already been shattered," he said. "Only the ceremony remains intact." Silence stretched between them. Serentino's voice turned softer, more human. "And if you're wrong?" Leo's answer came without hesitation. "Then I will be hated for doing too much," he said. "Better that than blessed for doing nothing." Serentino's shoulders sank a fraction, the way a man's posture changes when he realizes negotiation has ended. "Then at least let me shape the announcement," he said. "Let us prepare messaging. Let us brief governments quietly. Let us prevent panic." Leo nodded once. "You may frame it," he allowed, "but you may not soften it." Serentino's eyes narrowed. "And if bishops resist?" Leo's voice did not rise. It did not need to. "They will be removed," he said. Serentino left the office with the careful gait of a man carrying a glass of water across a battlefield. In Mexico City, Archbishop Ramon Valenzuela was preparing for a different kind of Christmas. He stood in the cathedral sacristy watching altar servers practice the choreography of midnight mass, candles lifted, hands folded, steps counted. In Mexico, Christmas was not a holiday. It was a season of identity. Las Posadas moving through neighborhoods with song. Novenas in family homes. Children dressed as angels. Old women pressing rosaries like lifelines. Midnight mass packed shoulder to shoulder as if the building itself could barely contain hope. Valenzuela had grown up inside those rituals. He had baptized babies who later brought their own children to the same candlelight. He had buried grandmothers who asked, with their last breath, whether they would hear the hymns again. He believed Christmas held the country together in a way politicians never understood. When his secretary handed him the encrypted message from Rome, he assumed it was a scheduling update. A liturgical directive. Perhaps a call for special prayers amid global tension. He stepped into his office, closed the door, and decrypted the file. The first line hit him like a physical blow. "All public celebrations of Christmas Mass are hereby suspended worldwide." Valenzuela's breath caught. His hand tightened on the paper. He read again, slower, as if his eyes had betrayed him the first time. Suspended. Worldwide. No exceptions. His mind raced through immediate images, people arriving at midnight, candles in hand, finding doors locked. Families crying on cathedral steps. Radio hosts shouting. Government officials demanding explanations. Protesters calling the Pope a tyrant. Priests refusing obedience for the sake of souls. Old women sitting in pews that would never fill. He read further. The decree's language was brutal in its clarity, funds redirected, compliance enforced, penalties for circumvention. And then, a justification. This suspension is declared as institutional penance and an act of justice until accountability is enacted materially and transparently. Penance. Justice. Valenzuela sat down slowly, as if the room had tilted. He thought of Rome, distant, marble, controlled. He thought of Mexico, warm, crowded, emotional. A decree could be written in Latin with surgical calm. But faith here moved through the bloodstream. He stared at the paper and felt his loyalty split into two competing obligations: obedience to the Holy See, and responsibility to the people who would suffer confusion like trauma. He reached for the phone to call his auxiliary bishop. Then he stopped. Because the decree warned against premature dissemination. And Valenzuela understood the trap: if he spoke too soon, he would be a leak. If he spoke too late, he would be a liar. He folded the paper carefully and placed it on his desk like a relic, except it felt more like a threat. 2 days later, Puebla's morning radio did what Vatican secrecy could never fully prevent: it turned uncertainty into narrative. A local host, famous for mixing devotion with outrage, leaned into his microphone and said, with relish, "We are hearing reports from inside church channels that the Pope has cancelled Christmas Mass, cancelled Christmas. As punishment." The word punishment spread faster than any clarification. In markets, women stopped mid-purchase, hands hovering over fruit. In buses, men lifted their phones and replayed the segment. In parish offices, phones began ringing like alarms. Some callers were furious. Others were frightened. Others simply asked, again and again, as if repetition could make it less real: "Is it true? Is the Pope cancelling Christmas?" Priests in small towns received messages from cousins and neighbors before they received anything from bishops. WhatsApp groups exploded with voice notes. A rumor gained details as it traveled, because rumor always grows to feed itself. Some said the Pope was sick. Some said it was political. Some said Rome was angry with Mexico. Some said it was the end times. Valenzuela watched it unfold with dread. He issued no statement yet, because nothing official had been released. But silence was interpreted as confirmation. People filled the space with fear, because fear was more comfortable than not knowing. In one parish outside Puebla, a woman knelt before a statue of Mary and sobbed aloud, "They're taking him away from us." Her priest stood helplessly behind her, because he didn't know whether, in 10 days, he would be allowed to open his own altar. The Vatican could survive many things. It could survive scandal, because scandal was familiar. It could survive outrage, because outrage moved on. But it could not survive uncertainty among its own princes. Cardinals began arriving in Rome with faces set like stone. Some came furious, others terrified, others eager, because any crisis was also an opportunity for power. The consistory hall is filled with scarlet. 37 men sat in a semicircle like judges, though their rings bore the cross. The air smelled faintly of old incense and old ambition. When Pope Leo XIV entered, the room rose automatically. Tradition performing itself even in conflict. Leo sat without flower. He did not greet them warmly. He did not attempt charm. He looked at them the way he looked at ledgers, as structures that could be tested. Cardinal Schwarzer spoke first. He was German, traditionalist, and sharp, his faith wrapped in discipline, his authority rooted in the idea that Rome must never appear weak. This decree, Schwarzer said, holding a copy like an accusation, is catastrophic. Murmurs of agreement rippled. You will create chaos, Schwarzer continued. You will fracture obedience. You will incite underground liturgies. You will push the faithful into apostasy. Governments will intervene. This is not penance, this is destruction. Other cardinals joined in, voices layered. This exceeds jurisdiction. This violates pastoral responsibility. This punishes the innocent. This will be interpreted as hatred of tradition. Leo listened without interruption, hands folded, expression unreadable. He waited until the room's pressure peaked, until fear had fully revealed itself as anger. Then he reached down beside his chair and lifted a plain grey binder. No gold. No seal. No dramatic stamping. Just grey. The room quieted, because even cardinals recognized the language of evidence. Leo placed the binder on the table in front of him and opened it. He turned it toward them so they could see the first page. A chart. A network. Lines connecting donation pools to foundations, foundations to accounts, accounts to legal expenditures. December spikes highlighted like bleeding points. €72 million, Leo said, and the number dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Schwarzer scoffed. Numbers can be interpreted. These cannot, Leo said. He turned a page. Then another. There were transaction IDs. Bank dates. Internal authorization codes. These funds, Leo said, were collected under the language of charity. Under Christmas campaigns. Under mercy appeals. A cardinal in the second row leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Leo continued, voice even. They were diverted through opaque structures. Not to feed the poor. Not to shelter migrants. Not to heal the wounded. He tapped a line item. To pay settlements, he said, designed to silence abuse victims. The room shifted. A few cardinals looked down, as if the table might offer escape. Leo turned another page. Not occasionally, he said. Not as an emergency. As a system. He looked around the semicircle. This is not mismanaged charity, he said. This is charity weaponized. Schwarzer's face flushed. Even if true. It is true, Leo cut in. Schwarzer swallowed his next words and tried again, pivoting to procedure. Even if there are irregularities, this is an administrative crisis. It is financial. It is legal. It is not liturgical. Leo's gaze hardened, not into rage, but into something more frightening, conviction. You are wrong, Leo said calmly. He let the word sit. Then he spoke again, each sentence placed like a nail. If we preach light, he said, while using darkness as an instrument, our worship becomes theater. A cardinal protested, Holy Father, the Mass is the Mass. The Mass is not a mask, Leo replied. Voices rose, now frantic with self-protection. You cannot do this without consultation. The bishops. The faithful. Canon law. Leo lifted a hand, and the room obeyed despite itself. The crisis of integrity, he said, is the liturgical crisis. Silence. Because the statement rearranged their categories. It dragged sin out of abstraction and welded it to ritual. Leo closed the grey binder gently. You fear schism, he said. You fear riots. You fear losing the people. He leaned forward slightly. I fear that we have already lost them, he said, and we are merely entertaining those who remain. No one spoke. Then Leo stood, the motion slow but final. Effective immediately, he said, there will be a global forensic reckoning. He looked at each cardinal as if assigning them personal responsibility. Every diocese, he said. Every account. Every foundation. No exemptions. No delays. Full cooperation with external auditors. Any refusal will be treated as obstruction. Schultz's voice came out hoarse. Holy Father. Leo's eyes turned to him. Obedience, he said, is not loyalty to me. He paused. It is loyalty to truth. And with that, the consistory ended, not with compromise, but with an order that turned the Vatican's greatest habit into its greatest liability. Secrecy. Now, the machine would be forced into daylight. And somewhere beyond those walls, the world was already beginning to understand, through rumor and rage and fear, that Christmas, as it had always known it, was about to go dark. The Vatican released the official statement 48 hours later, as Pope Leo XIV had ordered, with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision in front of an audience that had begged him not to. The document appeared on the Holy See channels in polished languages, Italian, Spanish, English, French, each translation smooth, controlled, careful not to tremble. It insisted the ban was penance, not punishment. It described the suspension as an institutional fast, a refusal to perform celebration while truth remained unpaid. But the world didn't read Vatican statements like scripture. The world read headlines. Pope cancels Christmas Mass. Church shuts doors on December 25th. Vatican declares global suspension. Television hosts argued over his sanity. Commentators called it historic courage or authoritarian madness depending on the channel. Governments issued cautious notes about religious autonomy while privately preparing for unrest. Social feeds filled with furious devotion, grainy videos of weeping parishioners, priests denouncing Rome, laypeople swearing they would gather anyway. In Naples, protesters carried candles and shouted prayers like slogans. In Manila, someone projected the word schism onto a church wall. In Warsaw, bishops convened emergency meetings that ended in slammed doors and unheard confessions. And beneath the noise, beneath the outrage and theater, something older began moving. Whispers. In basements and back rooms, in sacristies after midnight, priests spoke in low voices about private liturgies. About family masses. About the ancient catacombs, as if returning to persecution might make defiance holy. Rome cannot stop us, one young priest told his friends in a bar in Lisbon, cheeks flushed with indignation. The Eucharist belongs to God, not bureaucracy. Across the globe, loyalists and rebels began dividing without formal declaration, the way a crack travels through stone, quietly at first, then all at once. In Mexico City, Archbishop Ramon Valenzuela watched it unfold as if he were watching a storm approach across a flat desert, nothing to stop it, nowhere to hide. His cathedral steps filled with people demanding answers he couldn't give. Mothers clutched children like proof of innocence. Old men raised fists toward the sky and shouted, "Why now? Why us?" Priests were cornered in grocery stores, accused of complicity in Rome's cruelty. Valenzuela kept his own counsel. He obeyed the decree publicly. He repeated the Vatican's words, penance, not punishment, until they sounded thin even to him. At night, he sat alone in his office with the decree in one hand and a battered rosary in the other, feeling the two objects pull him in opposite directions. Obedience. Mercy. Truth. Ritual. And always, in the background, the approaching date like a blade, December 25th. Midnight moved across the world the way it always did, indifferent, unstoppable, crossing time zones like a silent tide. In Sydney, the air was warm, and families dressed in white linen as they walked toward churches that had always promised song. They arrived to locked doors and printed notices taped to stone. By decree of His Holiness Pope Leo XIV, public Christmas Mass is suspended worldwide. This silence is declared as penance and justice. Please direct your charity to the Independent Relief Fund listed below. People stood under streetlights reading the same sentence again and again, as if repetition might change it. In Manila, the humidity clung to skin, and the city's usual Christmas noise, carols, laughter, fireworks, felt suddenly obscene in the face of closed sanctuaries. A choir arrived in uniform, carrying folders of music, and stopped dead at the gates of the cathedral like musicians arriving after the concert had been cancelled. In Rome, St. Peter's Square remained open, but the basilica itself was dark. No choir lining up in the side chapels. No incense coiling upward. No slow procession of clergy in gold and white. The great doors stayed shut, their bronze panels reflecting only the cold sheen of street lamps and camera flashes. Tourists and pilgrims gathered anyway, because human beings gather even when there is nothing to see. They stood in clusters, speaking in subdued languages, the way crowds speak at funerals. Some prayed. Some cursed. Some stared at the basilica's shadowed windows as if waiting for God to appear and correct the Pope. It was the absence that shocked them most. The Church, which had always filled emptiness with ritual, had finally offered emptiness as the ritual. Across Europe, cathedrals that normally glowed like lanterns sat unlit, their stained glass reduced to black shapes against the winter sky. The stone interiors, when you could glimpse them through side windows, looked colder than usual, the kind of cold that didn't come from weather but from abandonment. Altars stood bare. Candles remained unlit in neat rows, untouched like promises not yet made. Nativity scenes sat behind locked gates, their painted faces frozen in a story no one was allowed to finish aloud. The infant Christ lay in straw under dim security lighting, as if even heaven had been put on pause. And everywhere, the same quiet shock repeated, people arriving with tradition in their hands and finding nothing to receive it. But the decree had not demanded emptiness without action. It had demanded exchange. In parishes across the world, priests who would have been vesting for midnight mass pulled on work gloves instead. In Chicago, a rector unlocked his church, not for liturgy, but for a warming center. The nave filled with the smell of soup instead of incense. Volunteers set up folding tables where pews once held kneeling bodies. Some parishioners muttered bitter prayers as they ladled stew. Others worked in silence, faces tight with resentment and determination in equal measure. In Krakow, a bishop arrived at a prison without cameras, carrying blankets and a box of toiletries. The guards looked confused. Christmas visits were usually ceremonial, brief, photographed. But he stayed for hours, moving cell to cell, listening to men who had never been listened to by anyone who wore a ring. In Lesbos, lay volunteers used church kitchens to organize meals for migrants who had no place to celebrate anything. They didn't sing carols. They didn't attempt to make the room festive. They just fed people and kept moving, as if speed itself could become prayer. And in Mexico City, Archbishop Valenzuela did something that surprised even his closest staff. He opened the cathedral's side hall and turned it into an intake center for abuse survivors and their families, quietly, without announcement, without banners. He placed chairs in a circle. He asked social workers to come. He asked lawyers to come. He asked for coffee, not wine. When the first woman arrived, eyes hollow, hands trembling, Valenzuela stood and greeted her not like a bishop greeting a parishioner, but like a man greeting a wound. "I'm sorry," he said simply. She stared at him, expression unreadable. "Where was that sentence 10 years ago?" she asked. Valenzuela didn't defend himself. He didn't blame Rome. He didn't recite doctrine. He just lowered his head. Not spoken, he admitted. And that is part of why the silence is here. Outside, people still shouted in the streets about Christmas being stolen. But inside the hall, something different happened, a kind of listening that no hymn could substitute. In dozens of cities, the same pattern repeated, empty sanctuaries, full hands. It was not beautiful in the way midnight mass was beautiful. It was rough, uneven, sometimes angry. And yet, for the first time in years, there were fewer speeches and more receipts. Pope Leo XIV spoke on December 25 from a bare studio. No balcony. No crowd. No gilded chair. No towering crucifix glittering behind him like an ornament. Just a plain wall, a simple wooden table, and a camera that did not soften his face. When the broadcast began, viewers waited for the familiar cadence, the comfort of tradition even in scandal. Leo offered none. "My brothers and sisters," he said, voice calm, "tonight the church is silent on purpose." The words landed like a slap in some homes and like a sigh of relief in others. "We have called this a season of light," he continued. "And yet we have hidden darkness inside our walls. We have sung hymns while refusing accountability. We have offered rituals while withholding justice." He paused, and in the pause the silence behind him felt like part of the message. "Silence," he said, "is the only honest liturgy left when celebration becomes theater." He looked directly into the camera as if looking into a courtroom. "This suspension is not hatred of Christmas," he said. "It is refusal to counterfeit it." Then he began listing actions, not intentions. an independent global victim compensation fund, governed outside Vatican control. Mandatory external audits for every diocese, every foundation, every restricted account. Immediate removal proceedings for leaders who obstructed investigations. Liquidation of non-essential Vatican and diocesan assets to fund relief and restitution. He did not promise that this would restore trust. He did not ask forgiveness as a performance. He said only, "We will pay what we owe. We will tell what we hid. We will stop pretending that holiness can be separated from truth." And then, as if delivering the final verdict, he repeated the line that had detonated the consistory. The crisis of integrity is the liturgical crisis. The broadcast ended without blessing. No, peace be with you. Just a blank screen. For some, it felt like sacrilege. For others, it felt like the first honest Christmas they had ever seen. Anger did not vanish. It changed shape. In the first hours, protests intensified. Priests live-streamed defiant house masses. Social media filled with videos of families praying in living rooms, tears visible on children's faces as parents tried to explain why the church doors were closed. But as the day moved on, morning in Europe, afternoon in the Americas, night again in the Pacific, another reaction emerged, quieter and harder to film. People began to notice where the energy had gone. Not into ceremony. Into labor. They saw priests serving meals. Bishops visiting prisons. Parishes opening basements for shelter. Lay communities collecting donations not for decorations but for victims and refugees. Some faithful softened, not into happiness, but into grim comprehension. Others hardened into defiance, convinced that Rome had betrayed the gospel. And for victims, those who had been ignored, delayed, paid off, or scolded into silence, the day landed differently. Some watched Leo's address and felt nothing. Too late was too late. But others, especially those who had spent years being treated like inconveniences, saw something they had been denied: public acknowledgement without conditions. One survivor in Ireland stared at the screen and whispered, "He said it out loud." Not he apologized. Not he prayed. He said it out loud. In that small difference, something shifted for people who had been trained to expect denial. By the end of December 25th, the most powerful symbol was not the protests. Not the headlines. Not even the Pope's address. It was the empty altar. Across continents, the same image repeated in millions of minds: the place where bread became body left untouched. The place where light usually gathered left dark. The centerpiece of tradition reduced to stone and wooden absence. It was a mirror the church could not turn away from. Because an altar without performance forced one question to the surface: what is left when the ritual is gone? Some found despair in that question. Others found a strange clarity. Christmas had not been destroyed. It had been suspended, held back like a breath, waiting for the institution to become worthy of the story it claimed to celebrate. Faith, stripped of spectacle, stood naked. And naked things were either embarrassing or true. Late that night, Pope Leo XIV returned to the same office where it had started. The Vatican was quieter than usual, as if even the building understood it had crossed a threshold. Outside, The square was mostly empty now. The cameras had moved on to other stories. The chants had faded into the cold. Rome had returned to its ordinary noise. Leo stood by the window for a long time without moving. He thought of the faces he had never seen but whose statements had filled his desk. He thought of the number, €72 million, still printed in his mind like a bruise. He thought of families outside locked churches, angry and grieving. He thought of priests serving soup, hands raw from work instead of incense. He did not congratulate himself. He did not pretend the cost was noble. He knew what he had done. He had removed the anesthesia. People would feel everything now, the betrayal, the loss, the anger, the grief. They would feel it without him to soften it. And maybe that was the only way anything could heal. He walked back to his desk and touched the grey binder as if confirming it was still real. The lie had ended. The performance had stopped. What came next would be uglier than ceremony and more dangerous than scandal, accountability, measurable and public, with no place to hide. Outside, Christmas lights still glowed in Rome's streets. Inside the Vatican, the altar had stayed dark. And in that darkness, a harsh truth held steady. Sometimes faith survives only after illusion dies. Christmas would wait, not for celebration, but for accountability. Before you go, subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and share your thoughts.